the Triathlon Show 329. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of that Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Bruce Rogers. Bruce has done a lot of research on assessing the aerobic threshold, or first lactate or ventilatory threshold, whatever you want to call it, by using the HRV-based marker DFA alpha-1, which can be measured non-invasively and for free or very cheaply. So this is an exciting potential method for assessing that first threshold, which can be important to inform training decisions and training monitoring. So we will discuss this research and the applications of it in the interview with Bruce. But before that, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. Precision Fuel and Hydration have a range of tools and products to help you personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so that you can perform at your best. Everyone sweats differently, both in terms of sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration, so hydration strategies should be individualized, and fueling strategies will also need to be adapted based primarily on the duration and intensity of exercise or competition, as well as on the athlete's ability to tolerate certain amounts and types of fuel. You can use the free online sweat test and quick carb calculator on precisionfuelandhydration.com to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs during training and racing. You can also book a free one-on-one video consultation with the team to refine your strategy. As a listener of the podcast, you can get 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products by using the code TTS22 at checkout on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, as well as prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. Today, I want to highlight Roka's range of eyewear. All of Roka's eyeglasses and sunglasses come with Geeko anti-slip technology, so they can never fall off your face. They are extremely lightweight and have unbelievable optics. The performance sunglasses are developed for and tested in up to the most challenging conditions and used in sports from triathlon through speed skating to outdoor and adventure activities. For prescription glasses, there is also a home tryout program, and you can renew your prescription with a simple online vision test at home in front of your computer. All products have multiple options for frame and lens, and they all come with a 2-year warranty. My personal favorites are the Rory prescription glasses, the Phantom Aviator sunglasses, and the Matador and Matador Air performance sunglasses for sports. Visit roka.com/TTS for 20% off your entire Roka order. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Bruce Rogers. Welcome to that Triathlon Show, Bruce. How are you doing?
I am good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. Let's start by, if you can give us a bit of a bigger introduction into your background and what your background is in endurance sports and in academia as well.
I'm a double-boarded medical doctor in endocrinology and internal medicine, and I became interested in exercise physiology a couple of decades ago. And kind of one thing led to another, and I teamed up with Thomas Grunwald a few years ago after he published some very interesting data on DFA alpha-1, which is a nonlinear heart rate variability index of fractal correlation properties and used an intensity distribution. And one thing led to another, and we'll be talking about all the information that has been yielded since. But essentially, I'm a clinician, teacher of other physicians, and this has become kind of a second career for me.
Yeah, no, that's what I gathered as well, and it's really interesting that sort of career trajectory from a medical background but also now really into the sports science, and you've been quite prolific in the last couple of years with publications, which we'll get into as well. So you mentioned already the main topic for today, DFA alpha-1, detrended. I will try to get it right. Detrended fluctuation analysis, and so is what DFA is shorthand for. Can you just tell us what is that?
Yes. All right. You've already had some information on heart rate variability and it's basically the, quote, variability of the beat-to-beat pattern. Alpha-1 is a little bit beyond that. It's not only variability, but it's looking at correlation of the beat-to-beat sequence. So if it's looking for patterns, and let's say you were a person and you had the choice of walking left or right. If that choice was predicated on your pattern of the last 3 or 4 steps, that's called correlated behavior. If your next step has nothing to do with those previous steps, it's totally random, that's a DFA alpha uncorrelated value of 0.5. So we have correlated patterns where there's actually order to the pattern of the heart rate, or I should say the RR interval, the beat-to-beat pattern. And then we have an uncorrelated pattern that generally occurs right around the FTP, the second threshold, the anaerobic threshold. And beyond that, it becomes what's called anti-correlated, which means those patterns always try to get back to the midline. So if you had a step pattern that was gradually moving away from the midline, once you get past below the 0.5, you're moving back towards the midline. It's kind of a self-regulation pattern. And I don't want to get too mathematical and too complicated, but let's just say that these patterns appear pretty predictably in people at given intensities. So a pattern in you of, let's say, 0.75 represents the same intensity as a pattern in me or somebody else who's 20 years older than you and 20 years younger than me. So these patterns are dimensionless numbers, and that's why they are so attractive. We don't need to do any comparative ramping. Even though we do ramps, we don't need to compare that to gas exchange or lactate unless we're trying to validate.
Yeah, so let's try to break it down in one step at a time here. So you mentioned first heart rate variability, and as you said, we have talked about that recently on the podcast. Mark Altini was on to discuss that, and just a reminder for the listeners, that's, as you mentioned, Bruce, the variability in the beat-to-beat time variability from in the heartbeat sequence. But what we're talking about here with alpha-1 or DFA alpha-1 is whether there is a pattern to that variability itself. So you can have a high variability, but there's still a pattern to that. And then you have the correlated behavior that you mentioned. But you can also have no pattern to it, that anti-correlated behavior. So whether the variability itself is low or high. So for low or high heart rate variability, you can still have a correlated or anti-correlated alpha-1. So it's important to not confuse those two terms because they are different indices of heart rate variability. Exactly,
and again, one of the more attractive properties of alpha-1 is its dynamic range. If we look at conventional heart rate variability index, some simple things like RMSSD or SDNN, which you guys have gone over, those are just simple mathematical equations, standard deviation, root mean square, and they hit a nadir, a minimum value, right around at the aerobic threshold. If you have intensity beyond the aerobic threshold, which is a relatively low intensity, that's the talk test. But if you go beyond that, there's no further information to be gained by looking at conventional indexes. However, with alpha-1, the middle of the dynamic range of alpha-1 is at the aerobic threshold. That's the 0.75. So once you get past the aerobic threshold, we still have plenty of meat in that heart rate variability index, in the alpha-1, to give us information on your intensity and such. So that is one of the advantages of the alpha-1.
Right. So let's discuss now, before your group started doing work with alpha-1 and how that can be used to assess your thresholds and be used as a marker of thresholds. What was done before? Because I gather that there had been some previous attempts at using different heart rate variability metrics and indices to do that, but maybe not quite successful.
Yes, actually quite a bit in the early part, about 20 years ago, early part of the century. They were using SDNN. They were using, again, where the variability became minimal would be the aerobic threshold. But that kind of lost a lot of attraction because, again, you didn't have any information past that point. Also, you needed to do a ramp to failure because you had to demonstrate a nadir, a minimum value. So you couldn't do like kind of a half ramp where your SDNN, let's say, was dropping and it looked like it was flattening out. And let's say you stopped. No, you actually had to keep going to just about failure because you didn't know if it would drop any further past that point. So again, there were many studies on using conventional indexes, but again, it fell out of favor. You needed a ramp to failure.
Yeah, and the difference now then, if we go into the work that you've been doing with DFA alpha-1, so what is it that you have done with that, and how is that different from what was done in the past?
Well, again, we weren't the first ones to look at alpha-1 and intensity of exercise. That's been looked at again for 20 years with plenty of studies. And there were, again, many good reviews on this that as intensity rose, the alpha-1 would drop. And if you look back at some of those old studies, there are clues there that around the aerobic threshold, the value was about 0.75. If you look at some of the older studies, they never went out of their way to say, okay, let's see if this thing is valid as a threshold marker. That was never done. And that's kind of how we approached it. Our kind of unique idea is, can we use this as an actual threshold marker with, again, dimensionless number? You don't need to do any calibration to a gas exchange or a lactate. Now, again, in validation, we do. But if you want to, jump on your bike and go out there and do a ramp or do some constant intervals and kind of work out what your power is at an alpha-1 of 0.75, you're going to be awfully close to your aerobic threshold most of the time.
Yeah. So what are the protocols then? Let's start here. From the validation studies you've done,
yes,
what sort of populations have you done them in, and what modalities in terms of sports?
First validation study we did, we used ECG data, very clean ECG data with literally zero artifact. The only artifacts were any type of atrial premature beat or something like that. Very clean data in runners. And we found excellent agreement with the 0.75. And actually, we used that same population for the second threshold, the anaerobic threshold, with the 0.5. Again, ECG data. The second validation study we did was in a totally opposite population, and that's a cardiac disease group, people with heart failure and coronary disease. And that was also an ECG study, all right? It was not a chest belt. They used ECG. And we found good correlation, good agreement with the 0.75. We did not look at the second threshold in that population simply because we actually did that study before we did the second threshold study. The third validation study we did was that just came out a week or two ago in elite triathletes. One of the national teams in Europe had a training camp, and we simply took their data. We didn't dictate a protocol to them. They did their lactate threshold studies, their type of ramp, which was a stage test on a special type of bike. And we took their data and we found good agreement with the 0.75 and the lactate threshold as determined by a log-log relationship. One of the problems with lactate, as opposed to gas exchange, is there's a plethora of different concepts of what constitutes the first threshold and what constitutes the second threshold. And, we could have a discussion literally for 6 hours and argue back and forth, which is better, which isn't. And that's the problem with lactate, how to interpret the numbers. But what I'll tell you is that whether it's 2 millimolar or log, it's going to be close to 0.75. There was another validation study. It wasn't really a validation study. They didn't look for that. This came out about a year ago. And what they did was a 5-minute interval analysis at a running pace of the first ventilatory threshold and the second ventilatory threshold. And they just wanted to see what alpha-1 was in a group of runners when they were running at the first threshold and running at the second threshold. And guess what? 0.75, and it was something like 0.49 or something like that. So again, very, very close to our data. So that's 4 validation studies right there. I just saw on Twitter this morning that a group from, I believe, Spain came out with another validation study using lactate markers. And again, all I did was I saw the post, but they apparently got very close agreement with the first and second lactate threshold, whatever they picked. I don't know what they picked, but whatever lactate threshold they picked, they got good agreement with the 75 and the 0.5 alpha-1. So that's now 5 different validation studies. And that's pretty darn good. We could talk a little later why you may not get agreement if you did it or somebody else did it. But right now we're 5-0 as far as validation studies.
Yeah, no, that's I saw the same tweet just before getting on this interview, and it was I think Javaholes is his name, if I pronounce that correctly. So if listeners want to go and have a look at that, by the time this interview is released, there might be some preprints already out potentially. We'll see. Either way, I think there's plenty of things to dig into there. The first thing that comes to mind for me, and which also kind of stood out when I was looking through your publications, is that we are talking about either using, like, these validation studies have been done using an incremental test with a metabolic cart or as a lactate ramp test, but then also this other study you mentioned with 5 minutes at the first and 5 minutes at the second threshold, which I hadn't seen. But my point here is that the validation has been done using specific protocols. And when I first started hearing about alpha-1, that was something that wasn't clear to me. Like, I thought the whole idea was that you could go out and run, and whenever you ended up below 0.75, you were above your threshold, and vice versa. And that's maybe not the case, because you still need to have the context of, okay, how was this validation done? It was using specific protocols. So can we talk about the protocols used and what that means in terms of applicability in training? Basically, do you recommend that people should do an incremental test or a ramp test to simulate what was done in the research to find their thresholds in a non-invasive and basically free way without paying for a lab test? Is that what is your recommendation in practical terms?
I think there are many points to your question that you just asked.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. And I'm going to divide it on 2 things. And maybe we'll talk about one now and one later. The first part was the mechanics of us going out and actually doing the run, doing the cycle, whatever we do as far as how do we modulate our intensity to achieve the best ramp or the most accurate threshold. So that's one part. The other part is, and I think the second part is the more important part. How do we make sure we're getting precise, not necessarily accurate, but precise agreement values to what we achieved and what others achieved in the literature? And that is actually a bigger question than the first. Now, you made let's go back to the first for a sec. What kind of ramp do you do? Can you just go out and do a mixed ride or a mixed bunch of running? That actually could work. We've examined that. I informally, again, we didn't have a lot of data. My partner, Thomas Grunwald, had some old stuff from a few years ago that he got from some soccer players. And, just running around during a soccer match. And we looked at DFA alpha as they were running around up and down the field, up and down the field. And although they didn't do a ramp, you actually could plot out their alpha-1 versus heart rate, and you can get a relationship. And I suspect that's going to give you a ballpark threshold as well. Now, if you want a really precise threshold, one that you can perhaps compare this month to next month after you change your training, or 6 months from now after you do a whole bunch of different types of training, then you want to do a ramp. And you want to do either something on Zwift or Trainer Road, or one of these formal ramps where they do really nice incremental increases on a bike, or some sort of ramp on a treadmill. Yes, you could do 3-minute stages where you do 3 minutes at whatever speed, and then on the treadmill, and then you notch it up and for another 3 minutes. And as long as you get kind of a linear rise in heart rate, your VO2 is going up in a linear fashion, because heart rate and VO2 have a very strong relationship. What you don't want to necessarily see, although you'll get a result on alpha-1, but it may not be as precise, is where you get a heart rate goes up and then it's steady state for a while, and then it goes up again, and then it plateaus for a while. Those are those long ramps, or I should say long constant intervals, where you do, let's say, 8 or 10 minutes at a certain power or a certain speed. Now, where that comes in handy is if you wanted to do it live, and you had Fatmaxer, or you had to do alpha HRV for Garmin right in front of you, and you said, okay, I want to know when my threshold is right in 20 minutes. You could do it. You would do your 5-6 minute constant power, constant velocity intervals, and you see about where alpha-1 drops below 7.75. That'll give you a ballpark. But again, if you want that precise 203 watts versus 210 watt type of precision, at least for comparative purposes, you need a ramp.
So if your heart rate stabilizes very quickly, maybe even 3-minute ramps might be too long, and you really should go for that sort of incremental type test where your power or speed goes up every 30 seconds or every minute at most.
Yes. Most people, though, on the 3-minute stages will look very linear. So 3 minutes is fine. It's where 5 minutes, 6 minutes is where you start to get those plateaus.
Yeah. Well, I can tell that, I have several athletes that would not look linear for 3 minutes.
Okay.
And so they would stabilize in that time. That's why I'm curious about that. You mentioned Fatmaxer and what was the name? Garmin's
Alpha HRV.
Alpha HRV. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about these tools, and are there any other tools that we should be aware of when it comes to analyzing this data?
Yes. And before I go over the tools for the data analysis, I'm going to do the second part of your question.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that has to do with, we have the same amount of data coming from our heart rate monitor. So you have your Polar H10, and you're getting your RR intervals and your incremental heart rate variability. And what do you do with that? And what the guys who publish the data do is they use a program called Kubios. And Kubios is a phenomenal piece of software that is pretty much the gold standard. But what happens is Kubios needs to what's called pre-process the data. And again, this gets into a little bit of mathematics and a little bit of biophysics. There happen to be what's called stationaries, which are slow correlations in the heart rate, but they're not part of heart rate variability, and they need to be taken out. And there are various, let's use the word filters, to filter out these kind of extraneous variations of heart rate. variability that are not really heart rate variability. So Kubios uses a certain protocol. And if you don't use the same protocol, or you haven't been validated to equal that protocol, then we're comparing apples and oranges. So let's say you make your own software to measure alpha-1, and you get results. I'm not saying your results are wrong, but I'm saying that for them to have any chance of reproducing our data, you're going to have to agree with Kubios, because that's how we did it. We didn't use your software to come up with our 0.75. We used Kubios. The guys from Spain who just put out that new paper, I'm sure they used Kubios. The other paper I talked about, they used it too. So everyone's using the gold standard in the literature, and we're all getting about the same results. Now, Fatmaxer. When Fatmaxer first came out, Fatmaxer is an app for Android that spits out alpha-1. It also records artifacts as ECG tracings, which is great for a guy like me who's a physician. So if somebody has a lot of artifacts, I can see if they have problems with atrial fibrillation, VPCs, bad beats. So Fatmaxer, when first came out, did not use the right, what you call the trending method. And the results were not very precise, not in agreement to Kubios. The developer was very, very agreeable to my suggestions, went back to square one, redid the software, and lo and behold, we have good agreement. Same thing with Runalyze, same thing with AI Endurance, which are both web-based apps. They did not use the Kubios method originally and got totally different results. But then now all those three apps are in line with Kubios. Now, the Garmin, this is not designed or built by Garmin. This just runs on Garmin devices. A couple of very clever guys, all right? I have a lot of respect for these guys, because you got to do this in a watch, on a Garmin watch, is like you got a blindfold on and you're navigating a maze. I mean, that's essentially you're handicapping yourself with processing power, memory constraints, all these different things, the different libraries you can use. Yet they designed an app to calculate alpha-1, and over the last couple of weeks, we've been tuning these detrending methods, these pre-processing methods, to align with Kubios. And I just did a test this morning. That's why I was kind of excited when we first came on the air here, and I got very nice results. It agreed very, very good agreement with Kubios. So we're just about there. Now, not all apps have that good agreement. And it's very funny about the agreement and the pre-processing. Some folks have more or less of these stationaries than others. I have a lot of stationaries, so I'm a good guinea pig to test the apps on. So certain apps like HRV logger just don't work for me. I can't get low enough. It doesn't pick up my stationaries well. But again, Fatmaxer, AI Endurance, Runalyze, and the new HRV, the app for Garmin, seem to do very well, at least in my hands.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me that of course you need to be able to use a tool like this. You need to have the same, or at least a very similar protocol to what it was originally validated on. I used to work with magnetic resonance technology and even did some publications in that field, and every single parameter in your imaging sequence needs to be in the publication, of course, so that others can reproduce it. But whereas in these publications we're talking about here, when we are validating something like alpha-1, it's enough to just say that we use the Kubios software, but then of course that's still it's a black box for other developers that want to. So the only thing they can do is just try to, as much as possible, emulate that. So it's tricky to be developing applications there when you don't have to. And I don't know if it's different legal requirements in the medical field, and that's why all the sequences had to be completely disclosed in the magnetic resonance field. But but yeah, it's anyway. I see I think that it's the what I'm trying to say here, that it's really important to be aware of that the fact that these things are validated using a specific program, it doesn't make it limited in scope. It's just how things work, and then it's up to, if somebody wants to validate it using another program, then they have to go out and do that.
Correct. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong.
Yeah.
It's what was used before. And the Kubios team has published their algorithms.
Okay.
They're out there.
Yeah.
So, and Fatmaxer is on GitHub. Yeah. So it's open source. So you could see what he did. I mean, so it's out there. It's not, again, I'm not a software developer, but apparently it's not impossible to do. So again, already other people have done it.
Yeah.
But again, it's the same thing. If you don't have an accurate power meter on your bike, you're not going to be able to train right either. So, just getting things calibrated to the way they were in publication data is very important. So that's kind of what I'll leave that with.
Yeah, no, exactly. All right. So then let's see here where we go next. So one question I have, going back to the evidence we had, you mentioned we have 4+1 coming out validation studies at this point. And you mentioned that you think that it's a pretty strong level of evidence. We have cycling, we have running, we have elite athletes, we have amateur athletes, we have more of a disease population, and
no, it was people with heart failure and coronary disease.
Okay, got it. What else? Is there anything else? Is there anything that is lacking, or anything that we need more of in terms of supporting evidence? Just quantity or different scopes?
Yeah, we need female data, and we're getting female data. I can't really say much about it, but we have submitted to a journal a good manuscript. I am part of the team. I was not the first author. Someone else did it, but I'm privy to the results, and it's going to be very interesting. But it was on a large group of women. And that is needed, because there's really very little in females. With the elite athletes, it's nice to see that. I made the argument in our article that there was no guarantee it would work in an elite athlete as far as the 0.75, because they have a lot of vagal tone. And part of the way the index works, it's about vagal balance, about parasympathetic and sympathetic balance and withdrawal of the sympathetic, of a parasympathetic system, overdrive of the sympathetic. And, elite athletes are going to have a lot of vagal balance, very low resting heart rates. There was no guarantee it would work, but apparently it does.
Yeah. And then one more question on the research side of things, and then we can go back into more practical and applied sides. What sort of levels of tolerance or error do you see in these measurements? Are we talking about, like, if you measure in watts, for example, are we talking that you're accurate to within plus minus 5 watts or 20 watts? What's the...
That is a really difficult question to answer. It depends on the quality of the data. It depends on what you're comparing to. For instance, if you look at studies, we've put this in pretty much every one of our articles, and I like it. It's one by Polaris, where their team looked at the VT1, the ventilatory first threshold, versus, let's say, the first lactate threshold. And they got a regression and an error that is about what we see with our alpha-1 versus the VT1, or alpha-1 versus the LT1. So none of these things are 100%. If you, again, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, first lactate threshold, there are many ways of deriving that, and they're all different. Even the first ventilatory threshold, if you had one of the foremost groups in the world read that gas exchange versus some guy in a small town who's using the machine to spit out the number, because there are algorithms in the machine to spit out the gas exchange thresholds, they could be totally different. So it all depends on what you're comparing to. In our runners study, we were very, very close, within a couple of beats per minute as far as the first threshold. But again, with the cardiac disease side of things, or the I think we were within probably 10 watts with the elite triathletes. I'm not sure what this other study is going to be as far as how many watts off. But again, there's going to be individual variations. And in fact, if I do the alpha-1 test on myself 5 times, I'm going to get 5 different numbers.
Yeah.
They'll all cluster around a certain area. But, again, the same with the FTP. You go out and you do your best 20-minute time. You're going to have a variation on that as well. So I wouldn't get too hung up. Am I 5 watts above or 5 watts below? But again, they are going to give you useful information.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So let's discuss some more practical aspects. We already talked a bit about the different softwares, and we might get into that a bit more. But first, you obviously need a heart rate monitor that is capable of measuring certain features. Not all heart rate monitors are fit for purpose here. Can you talk about that, what you need in terms of the heart rate monitor?
Yeah, I'll cut right to the chase on that. I would recommend, again, I'm not affiliated or paid by or supported by, but I would get a Polar H10 or maybe an H9. Several reasons. One, it has 2 Bluetooth channels. You always want to record Bluetooth. Ant Plus, I'm not sure if you realize this, has a limited bandwidth. And if you have a heart rate above about 140, you're going to get a lot of missed beat artifact. And we saw this early on when we started playing with this. So you must use Bluetooth if you want a nice, accurate, artifact-free tracing. So what I usually use is a Polar H10. One channel is going to Fatmaxer. One channel is going to my Garmin watch. Now that I'm using I've been testing the Alpha HRV, that new app for Garmin. Do you have a Garmin device, by the way?
I have a Garmin watch and a Garmin bike computer, yeah, and
Okay.
Polar heart rate monitor, but the OH10 actually, so it's not fit for purpose. So I haven't tried any of this personally yet.
Okay, yeah, so you should get an H10. But anyway, with the new app for Garmin, it has a little bit of a limitation in that it must get a Bluetooth channel. Well, okay, if you have Bluetooth going to your watch, you can't have Bluetooth going to the Garmin app for alpha-1. So you either have to wear 2 heart rate monitors, which you guys don't want to do, or somebody's going to get Ant Plus. So not that I want to confuse the issue out there, but if you are looking at alpha-1, try to use the Bluetooth transmission for that.
Okay, so now I'm not following, because can you transmit from your Polar heart rate monitor to the Garmin watch via Bluetooth? Because or is it only old Garmins that are only Ant Plus?
No. Okay, Garmin devices default for Ant Plus.
Yeah.
So if you pair your watch or your cycle computer to your H10, it'll immediately pick up the Ant. What you have to do at that point is it'll say, do you accept? You don't accept. You reject that. And then it'll say, look for Bluetooth. And that's when you want to look for Bluetooth. Now, if you're using that app, then you would actually pair your watch to Ant Plus and let the app take Bluetooth.
Okay, but the app is still part of your Garmin watch. It's one.
No, it is. No. It is part of the Garmin watch, but it's sucking in the heart rate variability separately.
Okay, yeah, but you operate it on the watch.
Yes, it operates on the watch as its own little, kind of self-contained program. Yep. It doesn't take what you paired the watch with as far as heart rate variability. That's the important thing.
Yeah, and I think this also requires a fairly new Garmin watch, because I think that the older ones don't have any Bluetooth capability. I may be mistaken there, but
no. I mean, I had an old Fenix 5, worked fine. I had a Fenix 6 equivalent, worked fine. I have an Epix 2 now. It's like a charm. It's phenomenal.
What about the Forerunner series? Are you aware of that?
The 35 is equivalent to the Fenix 5.
Okay.
That should work. Yep.
Okay.
And the 945 is like the Fenix 6. That should work.
Okay. So, but I'm glad that you mentioned a specific heart rate monitor that is the best in class. That's really nice. And then so let's discuss these different software options: the Garmin, the Alpha HRV, the Fatmaxer mobile app, and then you mentioned Runalyze, and there was one other web-based app which was
AI Endurance.
Right. Do you have any specific recommendations among these, or is it up to just personal preference?
I would say personal preference. They're all using the same trending, except the Garmin, the Alpha HRV for the watch. That's going to be, even though I think it's going to end up close, it's not going to be as good as a Fatmaxer on an Android device. It's not going to be as good as Runalyze or AI Endurance, but it's going to be close. All those are fine to use. I use them all interchangeably, and I validated them all.
Yeah, and are any of those free, or are they all? What is the pricing for them, if you know?
They are all currently free. I don't know if the Garmin app, the Alpha HRV, is eventually going to be a payment or not, but Fatmaxer, free, and again, it's open source. AI Endurance and Runalyze, I think, are free.
Okay, great. So then, in terms of application in training, we already talked about using the ramp test protocol. What would you use just as an athlete yourself? Would you simply treat it as any test in the past you might have done? Going to the lab to assess your VT1 or your LT1, and then you go back there a few months later to see if your training was beneficial and if it worked, and where maybe reset your zones based on that. Is that the same way you would do it now? You would every couple of months or so you would just do that specific test protocol and see where you are and reset your zones and then just go out and train, or do you use it more often than that in day-to-day training as well?
That's where things stood about a year ago. That's where we thought, its one and only use would be is to get thresholds. But since that time, we also published a very interesting study of what the alpha-1 looks like before and after, let's say, an ultra marathon, when you're running at a very slow speed before versus running at the same slow speed after. And we found a huge suppression of alpha-1 after a 6-hour trail run. And this opens up the whole can of worms for using this for daily readiness to train and durability. Durability is kind of a fancy word for measuring fatigue as you're going along. For instance, you whatever your first threshold is, you plug that in and you go, let's say, 10 watts below it. And, for 45 minutes, 60 minutes, you're watching your alpha-1 real time, and it's nice and steady. And then after 60 minutes, 75 minutes, same pace, it's starting to drop. And it's becoming more suppressed. That's telling you you're getting some autonomic nervous system fatigue, which is a sign of decreased durability. So that's one way to look at that, is are you getting more resistant to that alpha-1 drop? Instead of, I used to drop after 20 minutes. Now I can now do 45 minutes before I get the drop. So I'm getting better durability. The other thing is the readiness to train phenomenon. And this is where I use it every day that I bike. Remember, I'm an older fellow. I'm 65, and I do not have the recovery I had, when I was 62. Let alone when I was 35 or 40. So I've noticed that it's been very, very helpful for me to know if I'm tired. Sometimes I feel great, but in the warm-up, my alpha-1 is already dropping pretty low when it should not have dropped low because I'm just warming up. And that's, again, a very key thing as far as, am I ready to train today? Do I have fatigue? Do I have functional overtraining risk by pushing it too hard day after day after day? Again, when you're young and you're invincible, you're a lot more resistant to that. But again, even the young guys are going to get functional overreaching if they hit it too hard too often. And that's where I think the biggest potential in looking at real-time alpha-1 comes in is to know if you're ready to do intervals that day or ready to hit it hard that day.
And this is based on studies, for example, in the ultra runners, where you basically measured before when they were fresh and you measured after. And I think you compared to a control group that just went about their daily activities without any specific training to see kind of over a similar time period or the course of the day what happened. Is that what you did?
Yes, that's exactly what I did. And the interesting thing, if you looked at the alpha-1, remember it's dimensionless. So again, we don't need calibration here. The alpha-1 after the ultramarathon was well below 0.5. It was in that really high intensity domain, well above the FTP type of value that you'd see the alpha-1. Yet they were running below the first ventilatory threshold, a very, very easy pace. The other interesting thing that we saw, and other people have seen, is there was no heart rate drift noted. So their heart rates before and after the 6 hours and their VO2, their oxygen use on the treadmill at that speed we were using, the same slow speed, were the same. The only thing that really changed was the alpha-1. So again, yes, heart rate drift is one parameter that's very, very complicated. And it turns out that after, let's say, 5-6 hours of exercise, heart rate drift can actually be reversed. And instead of you drifting up, you can actually see a negative drift. But again, these are really complicated phenomenon. But the bottom line here is I think there's going to be a lot of use of alpha-1 in diagnosing fatigue and in readiness to train.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and definitely one where I'm intrigued to see what future studies will show in addition to the initial evidence that we already have. One other practical question is around the different modalities. For example, running versus cycling. That's one thing that I've heard just on the internet, that some people find that, it works great for cycling, but doesn't really work for running.
Yes.
People struggle with that. I guess the signal isn't as good. Do you have any tips for that?
Oh, yes. Well, a couple of things. There is technically running versus cycling shouldn't be different. But there is some sort of artifact, some sort of technical glitch that some people see that gives what I call the low A1 while running syndrome, where somebody is, they start with a walk and then they start jogging, and even before their heart rate gets up, the A1 drops, and it drops very, very low. It may have to do with literally the mechanical bounce up and down. I've written several posts on this. I'm not really sure. I can't give you a reason why, but some people clearly see that the minute they start bouncing up and down, their A1 drops. Remember, the A1 is looking for patterns, and if some sort of vibration or change in the way the heart is kind of positioned in the chest from the bounce up and down interferes in recognition of the pattern, the A1 is going to drop. What I've recommended for people who have that type of problem, you're not going to beat it by running. There's no way around it. However, like walking up a very steep incline, very steep, or a stair stepper, very steep, will work because you're not bouncing. Or just doing the cycling test and translating that heart rate to your running heart rate will give you an approximation.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. If you're fairly evenly matched across cycling and running, then generally speaking, I see that your equivalent heart rates will be 5 to 10 beats per minute higher, five on average, I would say, for running compared to cycling in well-trained athletes anyway, when they're quite evenly matched, just because there's maybe slightly more muscle mass involved in running than cycling. But yeah, those are good tips as well with the incline or the stair stepper. That should work fine. Yeah, and other than that, I was going to ask about what if it just generally doesn't match with your results that you get in a lab test, but I think we kind of covered that already with just using the reason that you must use specific processing methods, which is now implemented in certain apps. So that
I will add one thing to that, if you don't mind. If you have a lot of artifact will bias the A1 up. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, you're doing a run or you're doing a bike, and towards when you're really, really, hitting it hard and you're moving all over the place, the heart rate will show pretty accurately, but you'll be missing a lot of RR intervals in there just from all the noise and the motor activity. And if that's why it's really important to look at the artifacts. And if they're above 3-4%, 5% tops, you can't trust that data. So again, if you have nice and clean data where your artifacts are 2% or below, then it's going to be pretty predictive in most individuals. But one of the more common reasons that I see people have trouble interpreting their results is there was a lot of artifact in there that they didn't really appreciate.
And do these apps report how much artifacts you have, or do you need to do that in Cubios?
Some of them report, but yes, Fatmaxer will report per window, per measurement, what the artifact correction was, and Cubios, of course, will. AI Endurance, I believe, will, and Runalyze will too. So all of those apps will. HRV Logger will do that as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I think is there anything we've missed? I'm going to ask you to do a summary at the end, but before that, is there anything else that you think we should discuss that we haven't touched on so far?
Yeah, I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. One thing we probably talked about, but I want to emphasize, when you're doing thresholds and you want to accurately measure your threshold, make sure you're fresh. All right. Because remember, if you're not fresh, you're going to get fatigue effects. Now, that's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in that if you had an accurate threshold beforehand, it's going to tell you you're not ready to train and you're tired, and you better back off. On the other hand, if you're going to base your training on a fatigued value, that's a mistake, because that value is going to be lower than it should be. So make sure, again, if this is like your first introduction, that either you took a couple of days off, or I feel really good and my numbers have been great, and then I still took a day off, and then do a threshold. But don't do a threshold for the first time when you're tired.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else that we missed?
I don't think so. One thing I will say is, if you have users who are, let's say, cross-country skiers, or they're in various sports that are atypical, rowing, things like that, we have some anecdotal data on that it seems to work. But if those individuals, had questions, they could always contact me on Twitter or something like that, and I'd be happy to help them out.
Great. Yeah. We do have a fair number of non-triathletes listening, so you might well get a couple of questions from that part of the audience. But other than that, let's sum up. So if you can just give 1 to 3 practical take-home messages for the listeners about DFA alpha-1 and how to use that, what would that be? Okay.
First, I would use the proper measuring equipment and the proper software to get the value. Proper measuring equipment would be a Polar H10. Proper software would be AI Endurance, Runalyze, Fatmaxer, maybe Alpha HRV for Garmin, although that I feel is going to be kind of more our real time looking at the watch capability. But if I wanted an accurate threshold, I would use those other pieces of software because they're going to be closest to Kubios for now. Second, again, if you're fresh and in great shape for your test, good. But if you're tired, don't do it. The other thing that I don't think gets enough attention, as I discussed, is using the A1 during warm-up as a guide if you should train hard or not that day. And we already have a study on that that's in the manuscript preparation stage that looks very promising. So I think you're going to see more and more about that as time goes on.
So that would be almost the equivalent of what a lot of athletes are doing. A lot is maybe the wrong term, but some athletes are just assessing their lactate after warm up and seeing where it is, or let's say after the first interval of a workout to adjust the intensity up or down depending on where their lactate values are for the day. So equivalently, you can kind of do that with alpha-1 instead.
Yes, that's a potential. The other one I would compare most directly is looking at resting heart rate variability, which is fairly popular. And yes, there are a lot of apps for that. That's looking at the autonomic nervous system status. And if the autonomic system is looking like it's stressed and tired, you don't want to, add insult to injury. So it's not a good day to train hard. A lot of people either don't have time or whatever, they're too busy in the morning. I personally have never had a lot of variability in my resting, so it never worked for me. But the A1 during the warm up works for me really, really well, and that's one of the things we're looking at, and we'll look at more in the future.
Interesting, yeah, and thank you for correcting me on that, because it makes sense that obviously this is still a measure taken from the autonomic nervous system, so it would be more equivalent to resting HRV than to lactate, which is a metabolic marker. So even though they are both used in a lot of what we've talked about here today in the same context of establishing a threshold, a certain threshold for intensity, but still using very different methods. That's a good correction that you made there.
I will throw one thing in about practicality of lactate. I'm in Florida in the U.S. where it's hot and humid most of the time, and you can't do lactate outside. The minute you open that bottle or open that strip, it just kind of pollutes the strip from 99% relative humidity or whatever. So I guess you could do it inside, when you're on a trainer or something like that. As far as a field test, no can do. But again, alpha-1 is something that while you're outside, doing your warm up, you can easily do under any circumstance.
Yeah, good point. All right, so let's move into the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer each of these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports?
Yeah, I remember you gave me these questions, and as far as rapid fire, I had to think about that. And I don't have any particular book, but the resource, the ultimate resource, I think, is PubMed, Medline, the National Library of Medicine in the U.S., and that has pretty much everything that you'd want, either in abstract form, or most of the time things are either on ResearchGate, or again, you could usually get the download even if it's behind a paywall somewhere. So again, PubMed would be my resource.
Yeah, and that's great, and I love ResearchGate, and thank you for having all of your papers up there free for download. that really helped me in preparing this episode. Secondly, what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
That's another one I had to think about a little bit. And this gets back to my medical background. We were taught in my day in medicine not to believe anybody. So we were always questioning, always not believing the data, always being critical. And although, some, I guess, could criticize us that, we haven't found any the opposite as far as validation. And maybe it is not the case. It's not proven. Believe me, when I go through this, we look at things very, very critically. So again, one of my thought process is always to be critical of the data.
Right. Yeah. It's the kind of kill your darlings whole concept.
Assume it's wrong, before it's right.
And finally, who's somebody you look up to or that has inspired you?
I was thinking about that. And, if you look at different fields, there's so much subspecialization these days in medicine, in sports science, in engineering, in computer science. A person you'd look up into one field would be a nobody in another. So I thought, who really, did it all? And I thought back, Leonardo Da Vinci has to be someone that I would think did it all. I mean, from artistry to engineering, mechanics, again, true Renaissance person, had his finger in everything. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, that's a great one. And Bruce, where can people follow you? You mentioned Twitter already, and I mentioned ResearchGate. So those are two great places, and we'll put them in the show notes. Is there any other good place to follow you?
I have a blog called muscleoxygentraining.com. I labeled it as such in the days when I started the blog because I was fooling around with a muscle oxygen sensor. Kind of doing esoteric things with that. So that's my blog, and Twitter is BJRMD. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and looking forward to the research yet to come out from you and your team.
Thanks for having me on.
I hope that you enjoyed that episode. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com with a bunch of links, of course, to Bruce's profiles on Twitter and ResearchGate, and a bunch of the papers that he and his colleagues have done on using DFA alpha-1, both for assessing the aerobic threshold, but also for things like assessing fatigue, as we also talked about. Also related to this episode, if you want to learn more about heart rate variability, definitely go back just a few episodes to episode number 325 and listen to the interview that I did with Dr. Marco Altini on heart rate variability. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and want help to achieve your goals, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or a training plan. Whether you're just getting into triathlon, trying to qualify for a world championship event, or even want to race professionally, we have experience in all of those scenarios and would love to discuss further around it to see if we can help you on your triathlon journey. Find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com, and we can discuss your specific goals and needs and see what might be best for you. Next Monday on the podcast, I interview Dr. Mark Burnley. And somewhat related to this episode, we will talk about the first lactate threshold, or the first ventilatory threshold, the aerobic threshold, but we will tackle it from a different angle. We'll talk a lot about the traditional methods of gas exchange testing and lactate testing to assess it. So that's the main topic that we talk about with Mark, and Mark will actually be back in episode number 331 as well. It's a 2-part interview that I'm doing with him. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free online sweat test and quick carb calculator to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs and individualize your plan. Also, book a free video consultation with a team to refine your strategy. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of fueling and hydration products. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on Roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you can get on Roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.